And so this is really focus on
Is this you?
Yes.
as well as
Yeah, the name is it's his personal name.
they are all driving all that convention.
Perfect.
And how do they do that? So the fact that they need to evolve themselves to something that's aligned with the independent living principle.
Dat is wel
Self-presenting.
kan ik heel nee, de virtual call? Nee, dat is dan we zijn er zo meteen, ja. Oké, radio en ook represent. Ja, dat klopt. Ik geloof klopt. Het is vooral die dan aan het spreken hebben die maar ik moet de micro wel horen zetten. Like the micro well with
Article 32 is that ensuring that international cooperation, including international development programs, is inclusive and accessible to persons with disability. So everything about reasonable accommodations that we ask for within the independent living movement should be guaranteed. The second thing is that when facilitating and supporting capacity building, including to exchange and sharing of information, experience, training, programs, and best practices. If we translate this within the independent living terminology, support. So they are obliged to really implement peer support, having exchange, bringing up good practices between the organizations of persons with disability,
just
as
so
well
you
as from
know,
the member state itself,
the guy
and
asked you, do
support
you
the
have something
country.
to say now?
On that, in this perspective, we don't say south or north, we just say an exchange and peer support between the organizations. And training to enable them to participate meaningfully also. You cannot bring somebody and say, well, come, you can participate in a conference on development cooperation without training them decently so that their input is valuable and meaningful. So another point is facilitating cooperation in research and access to scientific and technical knowledge. That is something also where, from the independent perspective, is mostly ignored. Because whenever there was research between the countries, they forgot to involve us. So that's why it's very important now to ask Ali to reclaim, be more involved in this kind of research. And another point is then providing as appropriate technical and economic assistance, including by facilitating access to and sharing of accessible and assistive technologies and through the transport of technologies. So if we translate this in independent living jargon, then we could say that, well, this is what we call providing technical support, so assistive technologies, or other devices that support us, screen readers and others, also being paid to participate and also receiving also funding to pay for personal assistance, to pay for support, to pay for transport, to attend. So in order that they are not excluded and it's not something that they need to pay from their private money. So, and the second part of Article 32 is that the provision of this article are without prejudice to the obligations of each state party to fulfill its obligation under the present convention. So they just reclaim again that there is no excuse not to include persons with disability within the international development cooperation and humanitarian aid. And what is the link with the European Union? Well, the European Union also was the first regional organization that ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and this already in 2010. So they committed themselves to do all these things that are written in Article 32. And since 2015, it was reviewed. And so one of the recommendations from the CRPD committee was also to make it possible that organizations of persons with disability were involved and financed to be and need to participate also in the dialogue. But we will have a glance of that later on with Sarah. And also all the member states since 2018 also ratified the convention. So every member state where we are citizens from are also obliged to apply Article within their implementation of the convention. So now we will see, so what's the context of independent living in the European policies, internally and externally? So living independently and being included in the community is still a big barrier. But now we will have a look from, as the European Union and all its member states together, they are the biggest development and humanitarian aid donor in the world. And so they have a prime position to address the ongoing social inclusion and segregation of persons with disabilities in institutions. So apparently from the little data that is available, around 5 into 6 million of children are living in institutions worldwide. There are no figures in relation to adults and older people that live in the institutions on worldwide level. However, due to complexity of the European funding and the lack of transparency, it's very difficult to understand to what extent, in fact, the European Union facilitates access to the right of independent living and to be included in the community through through the policies that they have. But I think later on, you'll have a more in-depth view on this. And also from international perspective, as the European Union ratified the convention, they could play also a leading role in mainstreaming, because firstly, we looked from disability perspective, from the implementation of the CRPD, but they also have other international engagement where they could mainstream disability. Like, for example, they could take the leadership in global discussions on disability. And also, we all know that there is an European Union disability rights strategy, and there was no mention of any EU leadership in it or participation to promote disability rights, or that they should play a key role in the global mainstreaming of development and humanitarian action. So it could change if they took any leadership, by example, by monitoring and by the reporting mechanism of the 2030 agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the yearly high-level political forum where the European Union and many of the member states are participating in July. They could take the role every year to give us data on how they include persons with disability in the Sustainable Development Goals. We also have, for example, the United Nations Convention of the Parties on Climate Change. So every year we hear that there was a COP, the climate conference in different regions and different countries, but we never had any recognition of disability within the climate policies until now. Together with EDF, we are trying now for years to get the constancy. That means a kind of focal point on disability within the United Nations climate change system. And until now, it's still not recognized. There was a focal point on gender, on women's rights. There was a focal point for youth. There was a focal point, for example, on the indigenous people, but not for persons with disabilities, which means we are the ones already forgotten in all this discussion on climate change, but the impact of it is huge when it comes to persons with disability themselves. So that's another area we still try to lobby on. And then also on the regional forum on disaster risk reduction. They have also yearly regional forums when disasters are happening. We have them now as a result of climate change, but still there is not enough attention on the focus on the rights of persons with disability. Well, this is just to give you a global idea, but I think definitely my colleagues will go more in deep and go to and explain a little bit all this engagement of persons with disability can happen. So without further ado, I will give now the floor to Sarah. Just try to escape. And Sarah will explain a little bit the context of the policies at the European Union level on disability within the International Development Corporation. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Good. So my name is Sarah, and I'm EU Advocacy Coordinator with Light for the World International. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
There is background music. If you can put the background music down, please. Thank you. That's maybe for later.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? And now? I'm lucky. Can you hear me now?
So loud.
Hear me now? Okay.
Test. Intro. It's gonna be easier.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Great. Third time, fourth time lucky, I think it was. So my name is Sarah, and I'm the EU Advocacy Coordinator at Light for the World International, which is a disability and development and humanitarian organization. I'm also co-chair of the EU Task Group of the International Disability and Development Consortium, IDDC, which is a network of civil society organizations working together to promote inclusive development and humanitarian action. I speak fast, so please tell me to slow down if I'm speaking too fast. Okay. It's slow down already. Okay. So I'm going to, following Nadia's introduction to the topic, with the next few slides, I'm going to set the scene on what the EU is doing in relation to integrating or including disability inclusion in its international cooperation policies and programs. As Nadia mentioned, the EU and all EU member states have signed and ratified the CRPD. And as state parties to the CRPD, they have an obligation to ensure that their international cooperation policy, funding and programs are inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities. This is in line with Article 32 of the CRPD. Additional CRPD articles which are of relevance for international cooperation would be Article 11 on the situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, Articles 4.3 and 33.3 relating to the consultation and meaningful involvement of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. I think you could say that many of the CRPD articles are relevant, including those related to more sector-specific areas such as education, health, work and employment, and also Article 19 on living independently and being included in the community. As Nadia mentioned, the CRPD committee reviewed the EU in 2014 and 2015 for the first time. And they included recommendations on the EU's implementation of Article 32. Some of those recommendations were, in the concluding observations, were the recommendation to establish a systematic approach to mainstream the rights of persons with disabilities in all international cooperation policies programs, to take the lead in the implementation of disability-inclusive sustainable development goals, to put in place mechanisms to disaggregate data on disability in order to monitor the rights of persons with disabilities in EU development programs. And it also recommended that the EU should interrupt any international development funding that is being used to perpetuate the segregation of persons with disabilities, and to reallocate such funding towards projects and initiatives that aim at the compliance with the convention. The second and third combined review is ongoing, and in 2022, IDDC and EDF provided joint input for the list of issues prior to reporting, which focused on the EU's implementation of the CRPD in relation to Article 32, international cooperation, and Article 11 on humanitarian emergencies. In this slide, I will introduce a few of the policy frameworks at the EU level. There are many, many policy frameworks related to international cooperation, but I think one of the most important, which is not specifically on international cooperation, but includes a section on relating to promoting the rights of persons with disabilities globally, is of course the EU strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities. Section 6 commits the EU and its member states to uphold the human rights of persons with disabilities and support their social inclusion in all international relations and as part of all external action, policy, planning, funding programs and activities. There are very few concrete actions listed under Section 6, but they include ensuring that EU delegations, which are embassies in EU partner countries, ensuring that EU delegations play a more active role in supporting the implementation of the CRPD and fostering global ratification. This includes ensuring meaningful consultation and inclusion of persons with disabilities through OPDs and based on existing good practices. It also commits to systematically using a marker called the OECD Development Assistance Committee marker to track disability inclusive investments for targeted monitoring. And it also highlighted the importance of regular structured dialogues during the annual Conference of State Parties, or COSP, in the context of existing multilateral fora. And this included a commitment to put forward an EU candidate for the CRPD committee, which they did this year. So there is, from January, an EU candidate who will take up a position in the CRPD committee from January 2025. Another very important policy framework for international cooperation is what is called the European Consensus on Development, which was adopted in 2017. This is a shared vision and action framework for development cooperation and for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. It commits to applying a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. It also commits the EU and all of its member states to play a key role in ensuring that no one is left behind in line with the promise of the 2030 Agenda and SDGs. For the first time, because this is an updated consensus on development, this version included a specific reference to the CRPD and therefore indirectly to Article 32 of the CRPD, stating that the EU and its member states will take into account the specific needs of persons with disabilities in their development cooperation. In line with the UN CRPD, They will vigorously promote the rights of persons with disabilities and take stronger measures to ensure their full inclusion in society and their equal participation in the labour market. Lastly, on this slide, I also refer to 3 current EU external action plans where persons with disabilities are specifically referred to. But I also note that there is no specific action plan focusing on disability rights and inclusion in EU external action. The 3 action plans on this slide, and I won't go into them in detail, but the links are there. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to come back to me, are 1 related to human rights and democracy. The thing I would say here is that in the EU action plan on human rights and democracy, the EU commits to advocating for non-EU countries to ratify and implement the CRPD and remove barriers to inclusion for persons with disabilities. It highlights the importance of accessible infrastructure, transport, and information and communication technologies, and of ensuring access to quality education, healthcare, justice, and employment. The other 2 action plans are related to gender equality and women's empowerment, which includes committing to applying an approach that addresses intersectionality and an approach based on human rights. Again, this Gender Action Plan, or GAP, includes specific references to the CRPD and to Article 6 of the CRPD when referring to addressing intersectionality of gender with other forms of discrimination. Lastly, on this slide is the Youth Action Plan, which is the most recent action plan, and it's the EU's first policy framework for a strategic partnership with youth. It builds on the EU Youth Strategy and on the EU Strategy on the Rights of the Child, and it aims to deliver on international commitments to build a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future by enhancing meaningful youth participation and empowerment in EU's external action. The Youth Action Plan is interestingly implemented there are youth sounding boards that have been set up in different partner countries and in the EU by the EU delegations. And the Youth Action Plan recognizes youth with disabilities and the strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities, and to advocating for a formal youth dialogue as a permanent feature in UN spaces such as COSP. So having set the scene on some of the policy frameworks, I now want to just highlight the main EU funding framework for external action, which is known as the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument Global Europe. This is a funding instrument that includes a specific reference to the CRPD, and it again calls for a human rights-based approach to be applied to all programming, design, and implementation across all sectors of EU external action in order to make EU interventions more inclusive and sustainable. I won't go into it, but there are also other funding instruments which are more specific to humanitarian aid and to pre-accession assistance.
Maybe we can put it here behind also.
On this slide, I introduce a number of tools and guidance which the EU has developed on how to integrate or how to ensure a disability inclusive approach in their external action. The first is the EU toolbox on the human rights-based approach, which was actually one of the other few concrete actions under Section 6 of the EU Strategy on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that there would be an update to this toolbox. The toolbox makes the case for human rights-based approach to development, and it unpacks the concept and the 5 working principles, which are applying human rights for all, meaningful and inclusive participation, and access to decision-making, non-discrimination and equality, accountability and rule of law for all, transparency and access to information supported by disaggregated data. The other tool that I would like to mention here is the EU guidance note, Leaving No One Behind, Disability Inclusion in EU External Action, which is also supported with sector-specific briefs. The guidance note and the HRBA toolbox are aimed at providing guidance to staff working in the EU delegations and at the headquarters in Brussels, but also staff working in development cooperation agencies in EU member states, and to all partners who are implementing development programs on the ground. And then just the other two commitments that I want to relate, and I'm looking at Nadia because I have no idea what time I'm on now. Just two other commitments that the EU has made, which my colleagues will also, I think, refer to later, is the commitments that they made for the Global Disability Summit in 2022, and the fact that they became a member of the Global Action on Disability Network, which is called the GLAD Network, which is a coordination body bringing together different donors and development and humanitarian agencies, public and private foundations, as well as representatives from the disability movement, with a common interest to achieve inclusive international development, humanitarian action, and climate action. And it's guided by the CRPD. There are also a number of EU member states, such as Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Spain, and Sweden, who are members of the GLAD network. So there's plenty of policy and funding commitments on paper to disability, inclusive international cooperation, and humanitarian action. There are some useful tools. But what we need to see now is that more of those commitments actually being turned into concrete action and inclusive practice on the ground, and actually seeing that OPDs are meaningfully engaged in all stages of the design and implementation and monitoring of policies, programming, and funding. The last slide, which I won't necessarily go into in great detail, but you can find later, is setting out some of the main actors. You will have maybe heard me talking about some of them already in this presentation, so I probably should have put this slide first. But we have the main actors for international cooperation and development cooperation would be the European External Action Service, or the EAS, which also oversees the EU delegations in partner countries. And then there is, of course, the European Commission with DG International Partnerships, DG Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations, or DG NEAR, and the DG European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, or ECHO. And for each of these, there is a commissioner who, an EU commissioner who sort of oversees the portfolio of the work in these commissions. And we are, as many of you probably know, undergoing through a big institutional change at the moment, and we don't really know what the future commissioners look like. We have an indication, but there will be the process is to actually to decide whether they are go from not being designates to actual commissioners. There's also the European Parliament, and the three committees that are of particular relevance would be the Committee on the Development, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. And then at the Council level, member states engage through the Foreign Affairs Council, and then different working parties, including on development and international partnerships, humanitarian aid and food aid, and human rights. And I will now stop there, having set out, I hope, what is useful background on some of the policies and funding frameworks. And I will hand over to Kimber, I believe.
Maybe before, so thank you very much, Sarah, that you highlight a little bit about what exists already now, all the obligations, and also who's responsible in different areas on the European Union level, within the Council of Europe, and also within the Parliament. But I was wondering, who of you was aware about this, or has ever been asked or involved within your own country on development cooperation? Raise hands, shake hands, whatever, make a sign. Who was ever involved? Because this already exists, and for many years already. Was any of you in any project involved? Okay, we have 2 hands. So that says a lot. That says a lot about how we are really not considerate to be actively more involved in development cooperation. So the next speaker will definitely now highlight how we can do this. So Kimber, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Just bear with me while I get the slides up. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that volume? All right, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimber Bialik. I'm the Director of Programs and Network Development at Inclusion International. So I'm speaking to you today from a OPD perspective. I also, along with Nadia, co-chair a group within the International Disability and Development Consortium, IDDC, called the OPD Partnership Task Group, which is looking at how OPDs can be better engaged in international cooperation work. So what I'm going to be talking about today, as Nadia has just alluded to, is meaningful engagement of organizations of persons with disabilities in international cooperation work. So what we've just heard from Nadia and Sarah has focused kind of much more big picture on Article 32, our advocacy in that area, and what policy looks like at the EU level. I'm actually going to take us down a level, and we're going to be talking about sort of individual projects and programs within the international cooperation space, what meaningful engagement, or engagement is probably a better way to put it, of OPDs looks like in that space now, what we want it to look like, and sort of how we can work together as networks to improve that situation. So I'll just start by kind of noting a couple trends maybe that we're seeing right now in the international cooperation space. So the biggest one, I wouldn't say that this is true yet of international cooperation as a whole, but certainly in international cooperation focused on disability inclusion. We are seeing now that funders actually do want to see that OPDs are involved in projects. So they're asking the organizations that are being funded to do this work, which typically is not OPDs, often it's international NGOs or other large organizations. Funders are now expecting the people that they're paying to do this work to include OPDs in this work in some way. So as a result, that means that now more than ever, we're seeing more and more opportunities come up where OPDs can get involved in development programming. Both of these things sound like a good thing. Of course, they each come with a bit of a caveat. So yes, the funders in the international cooperation space are saying that OPD should be involved in this work. Unfortunately, at this stage, we wouldn't really say that funders know the difference between engagement and meaningful engagement. So if they are asking the organizations that they're funding to do development work to include OPDs, organizations are able to report back, yes, we talked to this OPD and that OPD, and there's not really a critical eye looking at that and saying, you know, is there actually shared decision making? Are you actually following the advice of the OPD? So at this stage, there's calls for engagement, but there's not yet calls for meaningful engagement. The other caveat is that, yes, there's more spaces for organizations of persons with disabilities in development programming, but we're not yet regularly being brought in at the early stages of projects and programs. So often, and I think historically as well, OPDs in this work have been seen more as maybe implementers or specific kind of delivery partners at the local level, not so much as conversation leaders or decision makers on projects. And that's still the case. When we're being brought in at a later stage, maybe as minor partners, and we don't have the control yet that we'd like to have in that space. So since we just heard that, I guess very few of us have been directly involved in international cooperation work before, and because we know that there's more and more opportunities coming up for our organizations to get involved in this sort of work, I want to talk us through what the OPD movement is actually calling for when we say meaningful engagement. So what do we actually, how do we want organizations that we're partnering with in this space to be treating us in these projects? So I've got kind of 5 key points up on the screen for what makes up meaningful engagement. So the first is, of course, that OPDs are taking part from the earliest stages. So we're not being brought in later once the project has already fully been designed. We're being brought in at the beginning. They're listening to the advice of OPDs about what the project should be focusing on, what the best way to engage with those communities are. Because we're involved in the earliest conversations, the advice that we're giving is actually being listened to and incorporated into program design. And it's not just being involved from the very beginning, it's also being involved all the way through the life of the project through to the end. So it's also not that they're asking us what the project should focus on in the design stage and then going ahead and doing it without us. It's that OPDs are involved all throughout the project as a partner. Shared decision-making is really important for meaningful engagement as well. I think what we often see right now when OPDs are involved in this type of programming, it's often as a secondary partner. So even if we're involved in the space, even if we're giving our advice on what the programming should look like, it's fairly uncommon for OPDs to be an equal decision maker in the actual design and implementation of the project. So shared decision-making where the OPDs have real power and equal power to any other organization that they're working in partnership with is really essential for it to be considered meaningful engagement. Making sure that accessibility measures are in place is also really important for meaningful engagement. I think all of us are probably familiar with the accessibility barriers, and it's the same barriers in international cooperation as it is in any other space. What I'll note here is that often in international cooperation programs now, I think we are seeing a lot more consideration for accessibility than we ever have before. It's becoming routine for project budgets to include budget lines that specifically focus on accessibility and reasonable accommodation, which is great. We're seeing more and more that in actual activities that are happening usually at a country or at a local level in these projects, that accessibility is being considered. Where it still isn't being considered at this stage is in kind of the governance of the project. So it's great that activities that organizations are delivering in country are becoming more accessible, but if the spaces where decisions are being made in the projects are still not accessible, you're not meaningfully engaging OPDs if we're not able to participate in the highest decision-making conversations. The fourth factor that I've got on here is that OPD's experience and advice and contributions are being valued. And when I say valued, I mean two different things. So first, valued in the sense of appreciated. So when we're giving advice, when we're giving feedback, when we're sharing our experience, people are actually listening. They respect the advice that we're giving. They're listening to it. The second way that I mean valued is in terms of monetary value. So something that we see a lot now is that organizations want OPDs to be part of international cooperation work, but aren't necessarily willing to put the budgets behind it to make sure that OPDs and their staff are being compensated for taking their time and expertise to take part in that programming. So we need to see that OPDs are being valued in both of those ways, both as kind of conversation leaders and decision makers, and also funded to take part in that work for it to be true meaningful engagement. And the last point that I'll raise here, and I think this is probably a key takeaway if you were to only remember one of these points going ahead to be advocating for meaningful engagement, it's that we need both an inclusive process and an inclusive outcome. So the current state that we're seeing in a lot of international cooperation work, organizations that are delivering this work want to be able to say at the end of the project, you know, we had this many people take part, this many of them were people with disabilities, they came from all of these diverse communities, they participated in these different ways. That sounds like a great inclusive outcome of a particular activity. But if none of the other stuff happened beforehand to make the process of getting there inclusive, so maybe OPDs weren't consulted in how the program was designed, maybe OPDs aren't funded to be part of the work. If you don't have an inclusive process to get there, your inclusive outcome alone is not enough for that to be considered meaningful engagement of OPDs. So the reason why I'm kind of setting all of this out just at the very beginning, so that we're keeping this in mind as our frame of kind of what we're asking for as an OPD movement. And keeping in mind sort of what the standard should be for our engagement in international cooperation going forward. I've got up on the screen here This is actually a ladder, I think they call it, of kind of different levels of engagement of organizations of persons with disabilities in work. So this was not designed exclusively for international cooperation. It applies really to any kind of partnership between OPDs and other organizations. And this particular text actually comes from an IDDC resource. The OPD Partnership Task Group developed alongside a steering group of 10 OPD representatives from around the world who were paid for their advice to take part in that. This guidance note that's meant to be internal to the IDDC network about how they can be better engaging OPDs in their own work. So I will just run through them quickly. So that red bar on the top where OPDs are excluded, I think we all know what this would mean in the context of a project. Either OPDs aren't engaged in the international cooperation project at all, or they're engaged in a tokenistic way. So meaning maybe OPD representatives are invited to take part in the space, but none of the accessibility measures are in place. So you're in the room, but you can't fully take part. The next level up is the informed level. So that's when OPDs are invited to take part. Maybe it is an accessible space, but we're really there more as passive participants. We don't have real inputs. We aren't giving feedback. For example, just being invited to be at an activity, but you don't have any real role or inputs. The next level up from there is the consulted level. This is where I would say most international cooperation work is sitting at right now in terms of OPD engagement. So we know that consultation is a buzzword in the international cooperation space more than ever. Organizations want to hear from OPDs, but whether or not they're actually actioning the advice that comes from us is a different story. So at this kind of consultation layer, that's when OPDs are maybe invited to give inputs into things. Maybe at a program design stage, they're doing some workshops to ask OPDs what they want to see. But we aren't actually at the decision-making level, and our advice isn't always being actioned. And then, of course, the top layer and the green bar is when we're meaningfully engaged in the work. So that's when all of that list of criteria that we looked at on the last slide are met. We're fully involved in planning. We're equal decision makers. The resources are in place. We're there and we're fully participating. So that's what we're always striving for in international cooperation. I will just talk through briefly. Obviously, I mentioned on the previous slide that we are not at the meaningful engagement tier yet in the majority of international cooperation work. So some of the challenges I'll just talk through that are some of the current reasons maybe why we aren't being fully meaningfully engaged, and also just some of the barriers to be aware of. So as a group, a lot of our organizations aren't actively involved in international cooperation yet, but if that's something that's of interest to your organization, these are also just maybe some things to kind of be on the lookout for. So the first one that I'll flag is the power dynamics that come with the role of OPDs in international cooperation. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the funding at this stage isn't really going directly to OPDs. It's going through intermediary organizations. So that's often large NGOs, for example, or other organizations that are not OPDs that then bring on an OPD as their partner. Obviously, what that means, if there's a different organization that's typically a larger organization, that's the one that's technically the holder of the budget, for example, they have a lot more power in that situation. And particularly for smaller OPDs, whether that's at the grassroots local level, if we're talking about programs that involve multiple countries, often you've got an international organization and maybe a national level organization that's involved in delivery. There's a lot of power dynamics that come with that, and it can be really difficult for us as OPDs when we are the smaller organization and when we're also relying on funding from this particular project to support some of our staff, for example, to be able to call out when we aren't being meaningfully engaged. It's going to feel like a risk, or that your funding could be at risk if you're actually holding partners accountable, and that's one of the biggest challenges that OPDs that are engaged in this work are having. There's also a big knowledge imbalance in the international cooperation space. I think we've probably heard this even just from our last two presentations. There's a lot going on, even just at the EU level in the international cooperation space. There's a whole bunch of policy frameworks that you need to be aware of. It's a very complicated network of actors that are involved in the space, both at kind of the broad international cooperation level and also in specific technical areas. So for example, if you were to go down into something like humanitarian action, which is a subset of this, that's an even more complicated space. It's a lot of information, not even accounting for, the jargon that comes with being involved in the international cooperation field, or, the very specific frameworks for project management, for example, that funders like to see in the work that they're funding. It's a lot of information. And when you're an OPD that's new to this space and is trying to get involved for the first time, there's no way that you're able to get all of that knowledge right away to be on an equal playing field with the organizations that have been doing this work for decades. So there's inherently a bit of an imbalance there that's challenging for OPDs to manage when generally international cooperation is not the primary activity that we do as organizations. It's a lot to learn. Timelines are another big challenge. So the expectation in international cooperation work is often from funders and from partner organizations that you're able to respond quickly, that things need to happen quickly. We obviously all know that the reality of a lot of organizations of persons with disabilities is that we're small organizations. Often we don't have a lot of staff. We're often underfunded. And we also have membership structures that we're accountable to, which means that even if you do have a staff person that's ready to answer an email, we might not be able to give an answer right away. We might have to go consult with our membership. We might have to talk to our boards, particularly when we're talking about things that are related to policies. There are kind of structures built into how we work as OPDs that could make it difficult to be responding super quickly. And that can be a bit of a challenge when we're working with bigger organizations that don't have those same mechanisms built into how they work, and they're expecting that we'll work in line with how they do. Accessibility barriers, of course. Again, I won't go into too much detail here because we talked about it on the previous slide, but an example that I can share from Inclusion International's own work. So for us, we represent people with intellectual disabilities and their families. And we had an experience where we were involved in a consortium project. So there were 12 organizations that were involved in this particular international cooperation project. And for us, making sure that the group that we represent is part of the conversations, that meant we wanted a self-advocate, so someone with an intellectual disability, to be taking part in the discussions about how the program should be developed and how it should be monitored. But it's when organizations are used to working a certain way, and this goes back to what I was saying about making sure that there's accessibility in governance structures as well as actual activities. It's very difficult to get a group of 11 organizations that aren't used to working in the way that you want them to work to have all of their conversations in a fully accessible way, to make sure that the tools that they use to track the work that needs to happen, for example, are in an easy to understand format, that everybody's using plain language in their writing so that it's easier for everyone to absorb. And that was a big kind of battle that we were fighting over the course of this entire project, where, it's difficult to ask organizations to change. And that's often what we're asking them to do when we're saying we need to put accessibility measures in place in governance structures. That's not to say that we don't have great allies in the international cooperation space that are really committed to doing this and are trying to work in a different way, but it is definitely an uphill battle for us as OPDs. And then the last kind of key barrier that I'll just flag is funding. Obviously, there is a limited amount of funding in the international cooperation space. There's a lot of organizations that want a piece of it. And a big kind of challenge that we see is that a lot of organizations and a lot of projects want to be engaging OPDs and don't love that means taking a chunk of the budget and giving it to the OPD. So this is something that we particularly hear a lot from our members that are working at the country level, where they're constantly being asked to contribute as delivery partners on projects, but are only given a budget to do the actual activity, nothing for, the staff time that it takes to plan it, or nothing that kind of would support their other overheads that need to go into doing this work. So that's still a big barrier that OPDs are facing in this work. So how do we actually make the situation better? Thinking about what we can be doing as OPDs to kind of hold partners to account on this. There are a couple of different things that we can be doing. So the first one, for organizations that do want to be getting actively involved in international cooperation work, just understanding program cycles and what the different elements of a project are is hugely helpful for being able to advocate for yourself. So you'll see on the screen, there's a diagram that's up. It says inclusive programming in the center, and then there's 9 circles around the outside. So this diagram actually comes from the International Disability Alliance's inclusive programming paper that they put out in 2022. Which is a really helpful resource for setting out what meaningful engagement actually looks like, what the current situation is, and again, and how we can work together to address it. So what you'll see, I'm not sure, it might be too small to actually see from the audience, but some of the things that are in those little circles around the outside, the top one says project governance and coordination setup. There's a circle for project and program design, one for communication and reporting, one for budgeting, one for monitoring and evaluation. It's essentially all of the different elements that happen in a particular project or program. So making sure that if you're involved in international cooperation work, you're aware of these so that you're able to say, you know, no one has talked to me or involved me in any of the work about monitoring and evaluation. I wonder what's happening there. I can follow up and say we need to be involved in this conversation. So just being able to track all of the moving pieces is one of the easiest ways for OPDs that are involved to get involved in all of those spaces. Just generally sharing resources on meaningful engagement is always useful. So I just mentioned this IDA inclusive programming paper that this comes from. That's meant to be sort of an outward-facing tool for any kind of organization that wants to learn about meaningful engagement. It's something that we can all be distributing. And I also mentioned that the IDDC has a guidance note on meaningful engagement. That's sort of the opposite type of resource where it's meant to be inward-looking. So that's something that IDDC developed and applies only within their network. But it's also a good example of organizations holding themselves accountable to be taking OPD engagement seriously. And that's also something that when it goes public, it is not yet a public resource, we would be able to share as a good example and encourage other partners that we work with to do the same. And then the last kind of key point that I've got here is just documenting. So right now, we don't have a ton of good examples actually written down of when OPDs have been really well engaged in international cooperation work. So if any of you are part of an international cooperation project where you feel like all of this has happened, you were engaged from the earliest stages, you were fully included, we need to be documenting those good examples so that we can share them with other organizations as an example of what we're asking for. On the flip side, sometimes you try new things to try and be engaged better and it doesn't work at all. That's also useful to document. The lessons don't just come from the success stories. If as a movement, we're being conscious to write down and share more of those examples, it makes all of our advocacy work easier. So before, I've got a final question for all of you, but maybe I will finish there before we go into that and just see if anyone has any questions they want to raise before I start asking you questions. Yes, I assume.
Yeah, all the participants will definitely receive, as well as the link to the webinar and to this panel, the whole workshop, and all the PowerPoint presentations. Yes.
Okay, so you will get the slides. I've also got my my email up on the screen there, kimber@inclusioninternational.org. If you can't get a hold of the slides or if you have any other questions. I think we had one other.
Yeah,
one other
there's some
question.
mics, yeah.
I don't know when. Thanks. I don't know whether there's a Q&A at the end of all this, but so far I have two questions. One for you. It's still a lot of theoretical stuff. You have very concrete examples of projects where you have success of a success story or a not success story. And I had a question for Sarah as well. we see that very often things only get moving if people with disability are at the helm of things. So my question to you is, how many employees or members are there at the European within the institutions? Theoretically, it should be, I don't know, roughly 10%, 10 to 15%, if you want to be representative. Is there an obligation of every MEP to have one person with disability amongst their staff? Stuff like this. So that could be make a huge impact if there's a self-obligation of employing representatively people with a disability. So my question so far.
Right.
So the short answer is, I'm not sure. Yeah, no. I mean, I don't know whether EDF or Nadia, if you have any idea?
Nor in the Parliament or in the European Commission itself, they have a code for engaging persons with disabilities. They have programs like Erasmus Plus now, where you can go to another country to study or to work. No, not for the moment. Yeah.
Staff that is employed to help people, and they don't want to create this transparency, it's painful, but it would be very easy figures
to highlight. You know what we need to do? We need to go to Uganda. In Uganda, they have legislation that every political party, they are obliged within the parliament to have one person as politician who has a disability. And every political party that's part of the government, they won't have one seat for a person with disability and one for a woman and then one for the youth. But then we need to go to Uganda. Yeah. Good.
And to answer your question about if it's still theoretical, are there good examples out there? Yes, I think there definitely are, but the problem is a lot of them aren't written down. So I can't give you, a written case study of this went well. But I mean, I can give you some examples of just in Inclusion International's own work. For example, we've got a project right now that focuses on humanitarian action, and the partner is the International Rescue Committee. They have been a great ally for working in an inclusive way. We are both equal decision-making partners on that project. They have been very willing to adapt their kind of normal ways of working to make sure it works for the people with intellectual disabilities who are on our project team and need to be able to fully take part. The project is still ongoing, which is why we haven't documented that as a case study yet. But I think more and more we are seeing that the organizations that OPDs are working with are at least willing to try new things. Obviously, that's going to be challenging in organizations that are a lot bigger and a lot more bureaucratic than what we're used to. But I do think that there are good examples out there. The other example that comes to mind for me is there's a big FCDO UK government funded project called Inclusive Futures, where the International Disability Alliance was one of the main decision-making partners. And they were trying to pilot something new in terms of a shared decision-making structure that hadn't really been done in projects before. Obviously, there are always challenges in trying new things. I don't think it went perfectly, but I think it was a good example of trying something and having a result be a lot more inclusive as a result. That project, I believe, also goes until 2026, so also hasn't been documented because it's not done yet. But all that to say, yes, there are some good examples out there. And I think we as a movement probably just need to be better at writing them down.
this person try to form alliances here, so that we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Come on later for sure. I think your disability forum have some tools, but one other inspiring practice is DPOD in Denmark. It's the umbrella organization of persons with disabilities, and they receive funding from the Danish government. They have staff, paid staff, to screen all the international development cooperation projects, as well as humanitarian aid.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Germany, working at an OPD. We are the umbrella organization of the Centers of Independent Living in Germany. And I can say, like, we have next year the Global Disability Summit coming up in Germany. And as I'm working in an OPD, I can tell you, German OPDs are not funded in this process. I'm working there for over 2 years. In my spare time, or yeah. I don't know. So we are not funded for all of that, what we are doing in consultation part, or like talking to development organizations, talking to Ministry of Development in Germany and so on, and giving our expertise, and we are not funded again. So that is like a negative example, I think. OPDs are not involved enough, I think. But I have another question. Because the GDS is coming up, and because Article 32 and Article 11 are very important, especially important for the future. But I wonder if there are national human rights institutes in several countries. There's even a network. So in Germany, we also have like a German Institute of Human Rights. And I was wondering, how are these institutes of human rights, who are like shall be monitoring human rights in general, especially the CRPD in our case in Germany, how are they involved in monitoring processes of international cooperation? Because we need these institutes. I see it in Germany because our politics in Germany are becoming very conservative and very right-winged, and we have far-right parties at the moment who already said next time they win the election, they will erase the German Institute of Human Rights, they will step out of all human rights conventions and so on. So it's really urgent. We need these institutes, and I wonder, how are they included? Because in the organization of the GDS, they're also not really included. I asked the German Institute of Human Rights, are you included in any kind of the GDS process? And they said, actually, no, not really. So we need them. Yeah, I really say mean it, and I wonder, how are they included? Thank you.
So I think this might be a good segue into our next presentation, actually, where the team at EDF, I think, is going to talk about the GDS, among other things. So I will hand this down.
Okay, then, so without further ado, I give the floor now to Marion and Erika from the European Disability Forum. Oh yeah, take the computer. Yes. I think you can unplug.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Marion Steff. I work at the European Disability Forum. So I'm very pleased to be here today at the Freedom Drive. Thank you, ENIL, for inviting us. Thank you, Nadia. I think we follow a bit of a logic here in this presentation with Sarah, who set the scene, and then we had the meaningful engagement from Kimber, and then today my colleague Erika and I, we're going to talk maybe more about resources. So we're going to present ourselves. So we're going to go to the next slides, and we decided to put a picture of us. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Erika, and I work with Marion at the European Disability Forum as an International Cooperation Policy Officer. Hello.
Thank you. So don't hesitate to come to us after. We want to speak to you a little bit more into detail. And Maria, I know we've been in touch by WhatsApp and email, so it's lovely to see you in real life. So today our presentation is going to focus a little bit on an overview of EDF, of course, the European Disability Forum, and the work we're doing in international cooperation and humanitarian action. And then after that, we're going to explain a little bit the work we're doing at different levels, at the national level, at the EU level,
also with the EU delegation. So the EU delegation are what we call the offices of the European Union in the world. They have about 140 offices around the world. So they play a massive role on the different continents. And of course, we cannot be here today without mentioning the Global Disability Summit that's happening next year in Berlin, but also the Regional Disability Summit, which is going to be in December, also in Berlin, which is organized with the European Disability Forum and other co-partners. And then Erika was going to propose to you some toolkits, some web pages, etc. So that could be helpful if you want to start your own journey in international cooperation. So I don't know if you're familiar with the European Disability Forum. We are an organization of persons with disabilities. We cover the region. That means we have a little bit more than 100 members in all the different countries, pretty much throughout Europe, not just the EU. And we work on a lot of different topics. It goes from accessibility, transportation, tourism, health, AI, etc. And of course, we focus also on international cooperation and humanitarian action. Humanitarian action is a bit of a new thing for us. That started a little bit more with the war in Ukraine, which is of course on the European continent. And I should say Nadia is an executive committee member of EDF.
Representing ENIL.
So we work closely with Nadia and ENIL. When we always been involved in international cooperation, if you want, but few years back, we decided we needed to have a bit of a plan because we wanted to understand ourselves which role we could play in international cooperation, because you have those wonderful NGOs who are doing a great job, but often they have offices around the world, and we don't have that. We're just a small secretariat in Brussels. So where we felt like we really had a role to play is trying to influence the EU at headquarters, where in Brussels, when they work on the different policies that Sarah presented to us, to all of us. So we felt we needed to have a seat at the table or provide some inputs into the different consultation whenever it's happening, so we can also make sure that people with disability, OPDs, etc., are represented. It doesn't always work that well. It doesn't mean because we participate in a consultation that we're going to be heard, but we're there and we're pushing for that every single day. And then also with all our members, and some of them are absolutely fantastic in international cooperation. You know, you mentioned our colleagues in Denmark, but we have also our colleagues in, you know, in Spain, in Italy, etc., that are really involved. And so together, we feel that we can support other OPDs, not just in Europe, but also working with OPD around the world, because we have so much knowledge and expertise all together. So I think for us, it was very important to feel like it's not because within Europe that we have the knowledge and we have the best practices. It's far from the case. And colleagues, OPDs in Africa or in Asia, etc., they've got other good practices that, you know, is worth, you know, exchanging together and promoting. So that was something very important and still important, working in partnership with other OPDs around the world. And to do that, you also need to have evidence. So Kimber talked about documenting, you know, practices. This is really important. We have to showcase that what we're doing, it's working, but we also want to make sure that we check with data what the EU is doing. For instance, there's this disability marker that the EU is using to see how much their projects around the world are inclusive of people with disabilities. And that's something we monitor at EDF rigorously. Innovation and learn is a topic that's very, very close to our heart. And for instance, where we wanted to, be capable of being involved in new topic or new project. And for instance, climate action for us is a bit of a new one. But we think we have a role to play because climate affects so many people, and in particular, people with disabilities around the world. So that's something we started our journey about 2 years ago, and then it is very interesting. And then, of course, we work on different projects. So we team up with other organization and we apply for funding. And then when we get the funding, we work together. Often, and it's related to what Kimber was saying, often we're not necessarily the lead. We will be one of the junior organization, especially when it come to international cooperation, humanitarian action, where you've got those big NGOs who have so much knowledge and staff to be able to apply for project. So this is something we're working on. Yeah. So if I go to the next slide, here we're going to go a little bit more to detail about how we can collaborate together. What can you do at the national level or at the EU level? What are the EU delegation? And of course, we're going to touch base on the Global Disability Summit and the Regional Disability Summit. But now I pass the floor to my colleague, Erika. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what we've seen so far, that Sarah really set the stage of what this all means in terms of international cooperation. And Kimber really went into why we need to engage as OPDs and why it's so important. And what Marion and I really want to do now is to hopefully give you those practical tools. So when Nadia next year at the Freedom Drive asks how many people are involved in international cooperation, hopefully everyone can say maybe, yep, I know what's going on, or I've had some potential work in this area. So that's definitely the goal. And I can also add that my background stems from Sweden and the United States. So I think I'll tie in some of those examples with hopes to give you some practical tips, if you will, to put things into context of how we can work together moving forward. So after your visit in Brussels, I encourage folks to go back home and check out if your country has some type of OPD that is already working on development or international cooperation. In Europe, there are a handful of organizations that are OPDs that are specifically working on development already, which is great. So I know, for example, in Sweden, that's the case. And we have an organization that is built on the other OPDs in the country, all collaborating to figure out how we can best ensure inclusive development. And that's a great first step. If your country doesn't already have an OPD that's working on development, take a look at your national umbrella organization or any type of organization that maybe is already partnering with other countries, because that's a first great step. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if some countries don't have it at all due to limited resources that Maria already flagged, that few of us have actual financial resources to be engaged in international cooperation because there are so many other things that, understandably so, we have to prioritize. But that's when I think we do have the opportunity, just as Sarah and Kimber said, is we look at some of those other organizations in our country that are working on international cooperation or climate, as there's a lot of conversations related to that on the international level. And this could be Save the Children, it could be UNICEF, it could be any UN agency that is based in your country. And there is a first entry point in having these conversations. And unfortunately, all too often, a lot of these organizations who do work on international development will oftentimes not have looked at disability rights at all. So I really encourage as that kind of being the first step, if you're eager to be more actively engaged in international cooperation. The first, check out if your country is already doing something, and then talk to the other organizations who might already be partaking in these activities. And EDF does have resources that we'll share that hopefully already gives you a mapping of what that can look like. But as Marion also said, from the national level, I do encourage folks to already have conversations with people in partner countries. EDF works really closely with our regional umbrella organizations, for example, the African Disability Forum. And as Marion said, we have just as much to learn from them as hopefully they can learn from us. Another practical example, personally being involved with the Swedish Low Vision and Blind movement, we have a relationship with the Blind Youth Association in Nepal, and we have study visits and exchange programs where we learn from them, and hopefully we can share our feedback with them, because we realize people work differently and find different innovative things to make things work. And to really have that cultural exchange can be really important, and also be a really fun and exciting thing as we also have these really hard conversations sometimes to make a more inclusive world. But having these relationships, or even talking with your Nordic partners or your European partners to learn and have that exchange, can be really important. So again, in summary, go back home, check out what the resources already are in your country, and have those conversations. Because in the end, what we really need to see is that the ministries of foreign affairs in our countries and the various development agencies that already exist include persons with disabilities, and there's meaningful engagement. I can say from Sweden's side, that is far from the truth, and funding that is coming from the Swedish government to support persons with disabilities is staggeringly low. And as we had a conversation about percentages and what we should see, arguably we should see higher numbers related to funding for persons with disabilities. And I assure you, in most cases, that is far from the truth. So there's a lot of important work that we need to be doing if we can, and recognizing there are competing priorities, but hopefully we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we can really collaborate to ensure inclusive development. Now, on the EU side, as we're all here in Brussels today, Marion and I, along with our colleagues on this stage, already do work on the EU level to ensure that the EU, anything that they're doing on international cooperation or humanitarian action, is inclusive of persons with disabilities. But that also falls on us from member states to advocate for an inclusive EU process. So for example, if you're meeting with members of parliament, it's always really useful to see what committees or advocacy efforts they work on, because they might be really active in these conversations on international cooperation or climate action. And then we can also, once again, push that they do not overlook or forget persons with disabilities in this process. There's very different elements how to engage and to ensure that our voices are in fact being heard. And I think we all agree that we've seen progress, but there's so much more to do. And I think if we do it together, that can be really helpful. But also I do want to touch on what EU delegations are, because I think we've had that word spit out at us a little bit today. But just as Sarah said, it's basically embassies, but for the EU in all these different partner countries. So on the screen, you'll see a map that is majority blue of the entire world. And that blue means that's where the EU has a delegation, and the EU is represented in some shape or form. So the aspect of international cooperation is all throughout the world. In terms of a practical example, okay, so how can we as OPDs from X country work with EU delegations? Well, here, the example I would share is that a part of the Swedish youth blind movement, we are visiting our friends in Nepal later next month, and we're hoping to ensure that our friends in Nepal can meet with the EU delegation to have this conversation and to build that partnerships to ensure that everything that the EU delegation in Nepal is doing is inclusive of persons with disabilities. Is this always easy, and do we always hear back from the delegations? Absolutely not, but we need to be pushing that to ensure that they don't overlook and forget us. And I think it's also helpful to be mindful of that it doesn't just fall on partner countries, perhaps in low and middle income countries, this can be the United States. I think the US has a lot to learn from Europe as well. So this dialogue isn't just on the development side, it's all throughout international cooperation as we're seeing new conversations related to the Sustainable Development Goals with the Summit for the Future, and that we really need to collaborate all together to hopefully ensure a more inclusive world. Now, what does this all mean in terms of resources and what can we do? And if we go to the next slide, we really want to emphasize 2 upcoming opportunities if you really want to take this next step in this conversation. And this is the European Regional Disability Summit that Marion mentioned, as well as the Global Disability Summit. These 2 events, particularly the Global Disability Summit, is the international stage where we as OPDs can bring forth what we want to see in terms of inclusive development, and where donors, organizations, UN agencies will pledge to the world that these are their commitments related to inclusive development or humanitarian action or climate action. And what we are asking the community to do is to ensure that their governments or their organizations and their country make these global commitments at these 2 events, particularly the Global Disability Summit. The first one that's coming up that's really timely is the European Regional Disability Summit. This will be an in-person event on December 6th, but it will also be online. Marion and I spend almost every day working on this event, so if you have any questions about it, we are happy to answer them. And we'll also share resources with you on how you can engage and partake. The same goes for the Global Disability Summit that is led by the International Disability Alliance. But again, the big call to action for these 2 events is to encourage partners outside of the disability community, as well as the disability community, to make commitments on inclusive development. And then finally, we want to share some resources to hopefully you can take back home and engage on these different topics that we've talked about today. The first element is that EDF a few years ago put together a mapping of how most countries in the EU are working on inclusive development today. So if you want to know what Finland is doing or what Denmark is doing or what Iceland is doing, you can take a look at EDF's website and find these resources to get a better idea. And these resources also kind of give you a play-by-play of how inclusive development works in your country and what agencies or ministries are involved. The next thing that we do want to highlight are the various toolboxes that we have, both if you're interested in engaging with EU delegations, but also if you want to engage more on the Global Disability Summit. We have a toolkit on our website that gives you the entire rundown of what the Global Disability Summit is, what the European Regional Disability Summit is, and how you can be engaged and how you can participate in these 2 important events. And then the other aspect that we do want to flag is that if you maybe don't feel like you have the capacity just yet to involve yourself in international cooperation, that's okay. There's so many other things, but we do encourage you to follow the news or the trends of what's going on in case you want to be interested in it later. And EDF does offer a comprehensive monthly newsletter, so we don't spam inboxes, I promise. And you can see what the latest events are, including the European Regional Disability Summit, or get more of these fact sheets that we do produce on a regular basis, both on how funding works in the EU and the resources to potentially engage, whether it's with projects or just what the EU is doing, or various calls to action. And the last slide I will show you is the QR code to EDF's website. So if you take a picture of this QR code, it will lead you to our international cooperation and humanitarian action page. And there essentially you'll get what both Marion and I talked about, but in a web format for hopefully for your convenience. And with that, I want to pass the word back to Marion.
Thank you, Erika. Well, we have a question, but I don't know, how do you want to do it, Nadia? Because I'm conscious
think-
of the time.
Yeah, we will maybe just open the floor if there are any are there any questions? For you? Was everything so clear? Yeah. Okay, the mic is coming. Yes, please. Present yourself and then.
Oh,
Yeah.
hello.
Yes,
It works quicker this time. This is good. Hello, my name's Matthew. I'm from the UK. This is my first Freedom Drive. I'm very interested in this workshop personally and professionally. I work in inclusive design for the RNIB in the UK. We touched earlier on how there can be crossover between the transition to a more independent world as we move to a more sustainable world as well. And I just wondered if any of the panel had any examples, case studies of good collaboration between these two sort of campaigning and development areas, or if you don't have any good case studies yet of practice where these two campaigns and communities have worked together, where do you have ambition of perhaps an example in your line of work?
Thank you. We take other questions, yeah.
Hello, hello to everybody. I would like to ask, especially EDF organization, do you have some databases or something like that, or about organization from country to country, who is a member of EDF? What we could start to talk, like first step, what Erika recommended us.
Okay. Let's go take another question here in front. Is there- It's coming. Just a moment, he will activate it. Yes.
Hello? Okay. Me and my colleague, we work for an organization here in Belgium for the visually impaired. We've talked a lot about documenting our experiences and our partnerships, but is there a kind of platform or a database where we can send our experiences and also consult experiences of other organizations?
Thank you. So maybe we'll give already answers to those questions. Go ahead, Marion.
Yes, okay, so it's a good question. The last question about the database of we've done that a few years back actually, where people were asking, well, but what is best practices? Well, how do you so what we've done, we have actually a bit of a document that we still have online where we documented all the different best practices when it comes to international cooperation that goes from, implementation or engagement with OPDs in different countries, etc., what works, etc. So, we haven't updated the document, but of course it'd be something really like something we could easily do at EDF, where we could maybe review that and maybe put a call on any other good practices that we can share with the EU, etc. And not necessarily, it doesn't have to be EU good practices, because practices all around the world. But if you want to, I still have the slide on the
on the screen with our email. If you want to get in touch with her, it'd be fantastic to see what we could be doing together. And I guess it's the kind of, it's the kind of workshop like this where it's great because we can exchange more easily. So don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Then the question before related to membership. So yes, so again, on our website, you have a page where you see all the different members that we have at EDF. So we have different categories if you want. And if depends if you're an OPD or if you're an allies, etc. So I can put you in touch with our colleagues working on membership and see if you will be interested to become a member or if that's what you have in mind. The advantages of the membership, I think, is what I witness is that we've got this community getting together on a regular basis to exchange, to learn from each other. We share a lot of information of EDF, but I hope we don't spam our members. But there's a lot of advantage to be together. And of course, when we see project for funding, we first share that with our members, or we will get together with our partners first, as opposed to other organizations outside the membership. So working together is really important. Shall I let you answer the last question?
Yeah, maybe the question about the link with independent living within the International Development Cooperation and humanitarian aid. Just maybe to highlight that there was a study done by ENIL for the European Disability Forum on it, and to see where the European Union money goes through. And unfortunately, the reporting was so poor that we couldn't have any good practice at all. And the majority of the projects that were financed by the European Union were still, in my personal opinion, a little bit post-colonial. It was still about buildings, it was still about hospitals, it was still about roads. It was nothing, there was not one project about emancipating the persons with disabilities through to their project, or even, and that's why we have a role from the independent living perspective to be sure that if they build, for example, a school that is an inclusive school, accessible, there's a whole package for to train the teachers, to train also the parents, to train the children themselves to be part of the regular school. Same thing with employment, same thing with that they don't do the same mistake they have done here in Europe, that they don't go there and build new institutions, new scholarships because the schools are far from those living in villages. That's not a reason. So that's why we have a double obligation to follow up within the development cooperation. They don't build any settings that is segregating children or persons of women or whatever with a disability from their assets. And maybe Kimber can complete.
Yeah, just to build on that, answering Matthew's question, some other examples that, excuse me, I'm aware of for international cooperation projects that are kind of working towards the goal of supporting independent living. So the EU Commission, for example, does a fair amount of funding of deinstitutionalization projects. There's one that I think you will probably be hearing about a lot in the lead up to the GDS because Jordan is one of the co-hosts of the GDS. But right now, for example, the EU Commission is funding work with the Jordanian government to help support their deinstitutionalization action plan. So they've got a project that's led by HI as the primary technical partner that is looking at one specific institution in Jordan outside of Amman. And the project is focused on kind of developing tools to support that process, retraining staff to be able to deliver support in a community setting instead, doing some work with families who are going to have people moving out of institutions back home with them. This particular institution in this project is made up primarily of women with intellectual disabilities. So there's a big self-advocacy component there as well. It's got elements of training community-based organizations to be delivering more inclusive service models. So that's kind of the type of work that's getting funded in that type of pilot project. Another example that comes to mind, Inclusion International has a project that's focused on Article 19 as well right now, that's funded by the US State Department, but that's more on the OPD advocacy side. So that project funds our member organizations in a couple of countries in Eastern Europe. So that's Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, to be building up their self-advocacy movements and then delivering advocacy interventions in their countries with their governments on closing institutions. So there is different type of work that contributes to the independent living movement that's being funded by different actors. So a couple of examples.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who want to ask a question? Okay. So that means that there is a lot of food for thought and a lot of things that we'll take with us. So before the end, I would ask every speaker maybe if you have a last thought or something that you want to share with us before we wrap up. Go ahead, Kimber.
Yeah, I mean, thank you to everyone else on the panel for some really interesting presentations. I think coming myself from an OPD network, I think we heard a lot of really clear action points for individual organizations of persons with disabilities, whether that's specifically ways that you can contact your EU delegation, or if you're involved in an international cooperation project, these are some things that you can be calling for. It would be interesting to kind of think through more as our next steps, you know, this people in this room as a network, or the European Disability Movement as a network, kind of how we're working together and supporting each other on allies on this as well. So not just in our own organization's work, but yeah, how are we supporting each other to move the needle on this? So obviously EDF has started that conversation and has a lot of resources for how we can do that. But yeah, I think there's maybe bigger food for thought here as well about how we're continuing to coordinate within our countries and within partner organizations, yeah, to make sure that we're supporting each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I can just also say thanks to you all, but I think also echo the importance of collaboration and coordination amongst different actors. I think there are many different actors involved in the international cooperation sector. And I think it's the element of learning from each other and continuing to build and document those best practices, as Kimber was saying. And I think from an EU policy perspective, as I said, I think there are many commitments on paper, both in terms of policy and funding. And I think it's really important to keep holding the EU to account that those are actually being implemented correctly and in line with the CRPD.
Thank you.
Pass the microphone to.
Thank you. So I would like to give you a homework. So when you go home, have a look at who is involved in your government for the Global Disability Summit. So you want to make sure that your government is going to be attending the Global Disability Summit, but you don't want just them there to be there. So we've done our job and we had a nice time in Berlin. You want them to commit and make, pledges to engage in international cooperation. Again, on our website, we've got a toolkit on how you can do that. But please go see your national government and advocate for that change, because we have to do it together.
And I think I'll leave you all with, I fully recognize that we have so many things going on and there are a lot of different competing priorities. And I think coming as a member from an OPD in Sweden, the question that I get asked a lot as I'm pushing international cooperation and inclusion is that we have so much to do within our own country that it's hard for us to engage on the international stage. And that is completely valid, but we also have our obligation, as does the state under Article 32 and 11, and we need to push this together, because if we don't, we're not going to have an inclusive world, which I think is what we all want. And I think to Maria's question earlier related to human rights institutions in the country, what I have seen, at least from Sweden's side, is that oftentimes international cooperation, particularly Article 32, gets overlooked in the conversation because of all these competing priorities. But I think the more of us that step in and have an engaging conversation with it and say, we want to be involved, we need to be involved, and we do it together, will come a really long way. And that we have a lot to learn from partners as well, which can be really helpful, and we do it together. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Erika. So on behalf of ENIL, I'm very happy that we have Rita now. Can raise your hands, Rita. Rita is our human rights officer, and she is working part-time now, thanks to foundation that we get from ILOBA and from STIL on international development cooperation and humanitarian aid. So we will definitely, this workshop was a kind of kickoff, a start of getting our members more and more involved in development cooperation and humanitarian aid. So we will definitely set up more workshops through webinars. And also one of the speakers that unfortunately due to some health issues couldn't be here today was Tushar Wali. He's the Disaster Risk Management Director of CBM Global. So his input was going to be from donor perspective, how they developed a kind of inclusive guidelines and standards in the disaster risk reduction and humanitarian aid that they apply. But we will organize together with him a webinar so that from donor perspective, he can show a little bit how good examples are possible that we could use to stimulate our own countries to duplicate or to do better. But it's possible, even donor can do that. With a private donor, then governments can definitely also follow up. So we will also create a kind of mailing list where we can collect also your practices, because the European Union will be reviewed in front of the CRPD committee next session, so in March 2025. So ENIL will definitely write a shadow report, and I suppose the European Disability Forum also. But we will focus on Article 19 and link it to all the other articles, from inclusive education to employment to supported decision-making and others, because we know that many people are struggling on daily within their organization, are reclaiming their own rights regionally and locally. So development cooperation is far from that bad, but it just show light that if we want all rights to be realized in our own countries, we should be solidarity also with those in other development countries. We can maybe avoid them to struggle like we have done since the 60s and 70s, and with peer support and exchange, realizing all our human rights to live inclusive in society, wherever we are and whatever culture is reigning and whatever political ambience is over us. We should not stop. We should not give our struggle or give our fight up, because the right parties are showing up, and they will definitely try to reduce any financing, any policy that include persons with disability, and then especially within the development cooperation. So I think it's the right moment. We will have new parliamentarians, we will have new commissioners, we have in many other countries also elections on the way, new governments. So now it's time up to us to learn how we can use this opportunity and use all the legislation that exists, but that needs to be implemented. Toolbox are there, a lot of organizations are there. We have our colleagues over here who can be a big support. We have Rita all here in front of you. So it is a big call to join forces and make development cooperation and humanitarian aid inclusive, as well as for ourselves, because we are vulnerable also when there is a disaster, as for other people outside in the world. Thank you very much for all the speakers. Thank you for the technical support. Thank the participants for being here and for your patience. And this is just a new start. So don't hesitate to come back to us and then join forces. Thank you very much. Lunch will be served just over here and behind the passage. So enjoy lunch, and the next workshops will start around 1:30. Thank you very much for all.